Hey, how's it going? Today, I'm going to talk to you about layout shifts. This is going to be a technical yet practical deep dive. We're going to talk about what can cause a layout shift through the angle of web fonts. And we won't just talk about layout shifts in theory. Again, this is going to be practical. We're going to talk about how to fix it. I'll show you some workflows and tooling that you can use to assist in your debugging journey. Just to be clear, by layout shifts, I'm referring to the metric as part of Core Web Vitals, where something moves on the page unexpectedly. It can be a frustrating and jarring experience for the user, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm in a rush to find something on my phone, and text kind of shifts out of the way because a banner or an advert just loaded. That's a frustrating experience for sure. I've made this web font demo, and it's a fairly simple web page, and I admit it is somewhat contrived. However, all the demos I'm going to be showing are somewhat augmented from real world things that I've seen in the past, and in some cases that I've even worked on in the past. I'm going to reload the page, and you're going to see this flash of invisible text. Did you see that? It was quick. I'll reload once more. Flash of invisible text, and suddenly it loads. Let's open up DevTools and find out how things are working here, and I'll do a little zoom in. If I inspect this text, you see it's got a class of web font too, and the styling is Victor Mono. And by styling, I'm referring to the font family. With a fallback of Comic Sans MS, which, interesting note, we didn't see that fallback, so we'll try and diagnose what's happening there. If I command click, DevTools takes me to the place in source code where that's defined. And there's the font family, Victor Mono, Comic Sans MS. Where is Victor Mono defined with the font declaration? Well, above, you can see that there's a CSS import for Victor Mono problem.css. I hit Command P, search for that file, open it up, and there's the font place declaration. A little thing to start thinking about. This says font display block, and don't worry if you've never encountered this before. We'll talk about what that results in a second. Before you start saying, hold on, this is completely unrealistic. Why is there a CSS file that imports another CSS file and so on? Believe it or not, some font providers still not recommend, but sort of rely on you to do this kind of sequential loading pattern. And this is just meant to exacerbate the problem. Wherever you see things like delay equals 0.3, that's 300 milliseconds, this is meant to slightly delay the loading of that font, just so you can visually see what happens when these fonts are delayed. Let's go to the network panel, reload, and we'll find out how those resources are downloaded. Yeah, for sure. You can see that sort of staggered or sequential technique, which is not ideal in the context of web performance, because ideally you want these happening in parallel. You've got the main page document, that's localhost. That imports, or that refers to a main problem.css. That main problem refers to a typography.css. Is from this point where things are really connected to the web font in question. One fun fact is you can also go to the performance panel and see the same network request, but within a performance panel recording. Performance panels are sometimes associated with render performance, so it's quite nice how you can also see network requests. There you go. This is not ideal. I'm going to make this a little more challenging for us. I'm going to zoom into the web page, and this is meant to as if simulate a sort of mobile viewport. And I'm going to do that performance panel recording once again. There we go. This is what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you how the largest contentful paint element is now that text that was originally a flash of invisible text because the web font was taking so long to load. There it is. It's quite nice how DevTools points that out for us. The takeaway here is that none of this is really good for performance at all. If we scrub through the screenshots right here, you can see big flash of invisible text, and then suddenly the web font loads. And again, that web font is called Victor Mono. That's going to come into play later. And you might be wondering, what is the problem here exactly? How would we quantify this? How would we justify spending time on this to the stakeholders in our business? Just because the header has loaded, the fact that the largest contentful paint element is delayed by this much, that's a problem, and that's going to affect your Core Web Vitals score, which in turn may affect your search engine rankings. It may have an impact on your user experience, or at least the perceived user experience. So None of this is good, and we should strive as web developers or as people that work on digital products, we should strive to create a better experience for our users. I want to show you another kind of interesting problem here. The slow largest contentful paint metric, that is a problem, don't get me wrong, but there's another little issue here. It turns out that you've got the fallback font that is loading in the background. When I say loading, it's not really visually appearing, it's just that the browser is saying Comic Sans MS. That is considered a system font. Therefore, the browser knows its dimensions and it can roughly compute what the rendered size of that will be, and that's the space that is being allocated. However, when it finally downloads Victor Mono, which is what you see in the screenshot over here in the performance panel, it turns out that the rendered dimensions are a little different to the fallback font. That is the system font. And as a result, if you look at the text underneath the web font text, it's shifting in position. And that shift is known as a layout shift because it's unexpected, it's jarring, and me as a user, I don't like this, and neither will your real-world users. So the browser and DevTools is able to quantify that layout shift, and it gives you a score. This isn't too bad, but again, this is somewhat of a minimal demo. We've actually got two problems here that we want to fix. We want to fix the largest contentful paint being so delayed, which is in turn connected to the flash of invisible text, but we also want to fix the layout shift issue. Let's try and better understand how this flash of invisible text thing is happening. Earlier, you'll note that we saw the font display block. Well, if we go back to that, just to remind ourselves, so I inspect the web font text, I command click on the font family. I see there's the Comic Sans MS, but the reason it's not actually being visually displayed as Comic Sans is because in the Victor Mono problem.css file, we've specified a font display block because in this hypothetical scenario, the stakeholders or the powers that be have said, no, we cannot accept a fallback font. Our brand font that we've spent so much money on, that must be displayed no matter what. Turns out we can reach a reasonable compromise, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. In my source code, if I turn that font display block into font display, let's say optional, this is maybe not the value that our stakeholders want, because what will happen is the browser will say, oh, optional, that means you're not particularly fussed whether or not we display the final web font. And in this case, the web font took so long to download, we're just going to stick with the system default that you've provided, or rather the fallback font. And we're just going to leave it at that. Let's try and be realistic and assume that the stakeholders in question in this hypothetical scenario, they say we can afford having the fallback font displayed for a short period of time, but as soon as that web font is ready, we want that. No problem. Let's change that optional into swap and reload the page. Better. Let's do it in the performance panel. Remember, try not to eyeball these things. Try and actually have a systematic approach where you're profiling. There you go. I just saw Comic Sans MS. It loaded for, I don't know, a second maybe. And then the web font came in. So fallback font first, web font after. I think that was a pretty sensible pattern. Scrolling through the screenshots, there we go. There's that transition state, and that is looking much better. And if I zoom into that segment over here, we can see when Victor Mono, when the WAF file finished downloading, that's pretty much when it got swapped in, hence font display swap. Let me zoom out and let's start paying attention to these layout shifts. I want to clarify with you why there is a layout shift happening. It's the transition between the fallback font, which is Comic Sans MS. You see that's got a particular set of dimensions to it. And then the web font comes in, it gets swapped. Comic Sans MS is actually 3 lines per paragraph. And then the web font comes in and it's 4 lines. Since the fallback font is so different to the web font, we want to somewhat normalize them to the best of our abilities. I happen to know from doing this beforehand that the fallback font of Comic Sans MS is really not ideal here. I'm going to change that into Korea New, which is a monospaced font that is very similar. I will reload the page and let's see how similar this is. It's at least 4 lines per paragraph, which is definitely a big improvement. I'm going to reload that. And look at that, scrubbing through the screenshots, I can see there is a massive difference. That transition state between the fallback font and the web font is so much cleaner and smoother. However, if I was to be particularly nitpicky, there is still a subtle change. If you look at the text underneath the web font text, it is still being shifted. And that is technically a layout shift. And please don't start fixing this thinking, oh, if we address this layout shift, we're now going to rank to the top of a Google search results page. Doesn't exactly work like that. Let's try and fix this layout shift issue, even getting to the point where we completely eradicate it. It would be cool if there was a way to customize this fallback font, Korea New, so that it somewhat normalizes with the Victor Mono web font. Turns out there's an interesting technique you can use to do this. If I copy this font-based declaration for Victor Mono, and I'll paste it in my typography.css file, we don't need the Unicode range, don't need font style, font weight, font display. Source will keep. We're going to change that ever so slightly. Instead of saying source URL, it would be cool if we could specify the Korea New. Okay, but that's not really a valid URL, so let's change that into local, which should just work. We just have one small change to make, so for the font family, I'll change that from Victor Mono to Korea New. This doesn't make sense. Why is there Korea New repeated a few times? Here's the trick. Instead of Korea New here, we call this my fallback font. Of course, you'll use something a lot more meaningful. I'm doing this for the sake of a demo. And I'll change that right here. This my fallback font name refers to this my fallback font declaration, and it uses that system font. So let me save that file, reload the page, and if nothing's broken, that means we've used the right syntax. That's looking good. Just one more time in the performance panel. Don't get me wrong, we haven't fixed the layout shift issue. In terms of how we get that fallback font looking closer to its web font counterpart, we need to use these font-based descriptors. I'm not going to go over the full list of font-based descriptors, but by all means do some research. I will, however, cover the ones that you might find particularly useful. One of those is size adjust. And if I change that into something ridiculously big, you'll see how this works fairly quickly. I'll reload the page. You see the fallback font has a massive size, whereas the web font loads in and it reverts to its usual size of 100%. By the way, in case it's unclear, if we were to capture that in a performance panel recording, which I'm about to do right now, you will see that layout shift score become much higher. And this is what in turn affects your core Web Vitals score. So I'll find that layout shift event, and you can see that's now 0.1. But back to these descriptors. Size adjust is nice, but what are we meant to do? Are we meant to just fiddle around with values randomly? No. Turns out this amazing community have built fallback generators. So I think it's screen span fallback. There we go. This incredible fallback font generator allows you to customize those descriptors so you can better match your fallback font with your web font. First, you need to upload the web font in question. Victor Mono, and there it is. Right now, the fallback font is incorrect. It's not what we are using in our website. So I'm going to find the monospaced section and select Korea New. Already we can see the fonts definitely are pretty close, but it's not identical. So let's play around with this adjust size property. And you can see as I drag the slider here, the size adjust property changes there. Okay, I'm not really sure what this is meant to be. Just going to leave it at 100%. Let's move on to the accent override. This is interesting. Yeah, that looks maybe there. 102%, is that right? Let's try that. Accent override of 102%. Okay, back to the web page. Make sure everything's nice and ready. We'll clear the previous recording. And in the code editor, I'll add in that descriptor or adjuster, as it's sometimes called, accent override of 102%. Reload the page and capture a performance panel recording, and hopefully we fixed the issue. I don't know if you just saw that, it's very subtle, but that looked so much better. Don't worry, we'll dive into the screenshot, which is a bit more reproducible. Ah, that is so much nicer. it seems there still is some very subtle layout shift happening. How do we get all the way to eradicate this tiny, tiny layout shift? I'm pretty sure that I need to fiddle around with this descent override, but at this point, I'm just eyeballing it and it doesn't feel very scientific. And I don't want to fiddle around with these values and maybe make something worse. I want to be systematic about this. Let's find another incredible tool made by this community, available for us to use completely free of charge. Here we go. It's a similar looking thing where you upload the font in question. There's Victor Mono, but instead of it being all based around fallback fonts, it's kind of based around font metrics and being able to look at data for your given uploaded font. I've uploaded Victor Mono. I hit the data menu or the data tab, and I'm going to do a Command F for Ascender. And you see there's two interesting values, ascender and descender, of 1100 and -250. If you're like me, you look at this and you get a bit overwhelmed. So I'm going to quickly transition over to a slightly different tool. And this is something like Capsize. Here we go. Capsize. Flipping how we define typography in CSS. Very nice. I don't even have to upload the font. I can just search for Victor Mono, click there, and there we go. This is really the information that we need. We need an ascender and descender. And by the way, the formula that I'm about to show you does assume that your font has an m² of 1000. Anyway, we've got an ascender of 1100. So what do? I'm going to go to the console panel, just using this as a calculator. 1100 divided by 10, 110. Why did I need to use a console panel to figure that out? So 110%. Let's get that into our code base. And then for the descent override, can you guess what that's going to be? So that's 250. 250 divided by 10, that's 25%. There we go. Let's reload the page and maybe take a guess as to what might happen. That was nice. It was very subtle, so I don't blame you if you missed it, but we will check again in the screenshot. There we go. That transition is fantastic. Unless I'm mistaken, there is no layout shift happening there. Let me just double check in DevTools. If you consider frames, timing, main, thread pool, preload scanner, these rows on the left, if you consider them to be tracks, which is what they're referred to as in DevTools, notice there is no layout shift track, which is great because that means there is no layout shift happening. What took us just a few extra lines of code really delivered quite a different user experience in terms of layout shift. Let me just zoom in to the page a bit like I had before, reload the page and just see. Yeah, there's definitely no layout shift happening. Look at this text over here. Ah, that's great. And then once more in the performance panel with the page zoomed in just to make sure everything is smooth. If we scrub through the screenshots in the performance panel, for sure that transition is great. No text elsewhere is being affected. No layout is being affected. And if we look at the LCP, the largest contentful paint metric, that is happening so much earlier. And in fact, which by the way is out of scope for this video, if we wanted to even address the issue of LCP, I mean, it's just a case of not being so sequential with these resource downloads, where you have one CSS file importing another, which imports another. That was kind of left in there as an exercise for the viewer. Let's quickly recap. If you remember, we went into the Victor Mono CSS file, which, by the way, a lot of font providers follow a similar pattern where you'll import this dedicated style sheet, maybe from a remote URL, and it will look somewhat like this. The point is that this web font is slow. It takes a second to download, which of course in the real world won't have this question mark delay = 1, but you get the point that I'm trying to illustrate. Originally, that was font display block. We get it. It's important to display the web font, fine, but let's be a bit more reasonable and use font display swap so that the browser has some flexibility as to when it can use the fallback font and when it can use the web font. We didn't just do font display swap. We also pretty much duplicated this font-based declaration and tracked it over here, but changed the web font to basically be a fallback font. And that is, helpfully called my fallback font. That is a system default font which closely resembles the web font in question. And then finally, we added these font face adjusters or descriptors to apply these very subtle changes in the way the font is rendered. When we made all these changes, rather than just eyeballing it and reloading the page, which, don't get me wrong, continue to do, but more importantly, we profiled it. We came to the DevTools performance panel and noticed that the layout shifts track had completely disappeared, which is an indicator that there are no layout shifts in the recording we just made. We can verify that in the screenshot by scrubbing through. We can also double check the Core Web Vitals metric, LCP, is happening a lot earlier rather than coinciding with the point at which the web font finishes downloading, which is a pattern that I have seen in the past. We also saw this capsize tool where you pretty much just select the font in question from Google Fonts or you upload your own, and it will give you the metrics that you care about. And we were able to do that all without any custom JavaScript or without any JavaScript plugins or custom font loaders. One very small note, you might have been seeing those layout shift records earlier and be seeing values like 0.01 and thinking, that is so small, why are you making as if it's a bigger deal than it actually is? In the past, I have worked on websites or been involved with websites where things were shifting all around the page and scroll bars appearing and disappearing. I actually made a very extreme version of that problem, which is here. And it's meant to get your mind thinking a bit differently when it comes to layout shifts. This little demo, which I'll share the link with you in a second, is meant to show how the simple downloading of a web font, no JavaScript at all, can actually cause content to disappear entirely. And how does that look like in this very contrived demo, you ask? If I go to the Elements panel, we've got a bunch of block level paragraph tags. And right now, this is after the web font has loaded. Again, this is Victor Mono. But what I'll do is I'll go to the network panel and I will block Victor Mono. That file is blocked and that web font shouldn't load. This is the before state. This is before the web font has loaded. Notice that the paragraphs, almost by coincidence, I'm joking, I've done this for the sake of a demo, of course, spans pretty much the full height of the viewport. Now ask yourself a question, what happens when we get one extra paragraph or two? If you're saying to yourself, well, a vertical scroll bar is going to appear, you would be correct. Now what happens when that vertical scroll bar appears? What happens to the dimensions of, for example, this first paragraph tag, which currently is 489 pixels wide? And let's go a step further. If we open up this style tag, and again, remember that paragraph is 489 pixels wide. So if we open up the style tag, you've got a CSS container query, which is out of scope for this video, but a super cool technique to use in CSS nowadays. You've got a container query that says, when the container is less than 489 pixels, just display none, a bunch of paragraphs, all the odd paragraphs. This is, of course, such a bizarre technique to use, but this is meant to be reflective of scenarios where I've seen these JavaScript widget plugins which lay out and place widgets all across the page. And as soon as the user resizes a widget, turns out everything jumbles around, a bunch of JavaScript kicks off, and it just became such a pain to diagnose. Let me unblock that font. In fact, I can just open up this drawer here, disable request blocking. At this point, just reload the page and you'll see how this container query actually applies in this case. There we go. The web font downloads. The text is no longer 489 pixels, but rather it's a lot less, all because there is now a scroll bar. Anyway, if you would like to try out these demos, this is the URL. I'll put it on screen right now. Do go and check it out. Have a fiddle around in DevTools. If you'd like to see more practical examples of layout shifts happening in the real world, we can be sure to show you that. Thank you for watching. Catch you later.